Thank you for that wonderful panel discussion. I found that very interesting. So many of you know me, not all of you know me. I'm Rowena Schoo. I work for something called the Netbeakon Institute. And today I've been asked to talk to you a bit about DNS abuse and what that looks like in the Baltics. I understand you've had presentations going in both directions in the past. Some have said there's no abuse, some have said there's lots of it. So I'm going to take you through the data project that we run at the Institute and give you some information on both what that looks like for ccTLDs and what that looks like for registrars. Okay, so first up, what is the Institute? So the Netbeakon Institute was created by Public Interest Registry in 2021. PIR runs the .org top-level registry, and they are a charity registered in the US. So the money that they make from running .org and the other TLDs they have to reinvest into the public purpose. And so one of the things that they do, one of the initiatives they run is the Netbeakon Institute. So we are part of PIR, we're fully funded by PIR, but the work that we do is much more external facing. So we run projects primarily for registries and registrars to try to create a safer internet. We do a lot of work as well, collaborating and educating people within the industry, but also external to the industry that want to understand these issues. And basically, the Institute is really primarily two people, which is me and Graham Bunton, who some of you may know. Graham came from a registrar background, and I came from a registry background, having previously worked for Nominet, the UK ccTLD, and some government and regulatory experience as well. So one of our main projects is called the Netbeakon Measurement and Analytics Platform, or Netbeakon MAP for short. This is a project that we created when we started the Institute because we felt that people talked about this term, DNS abuse, quite a lot, but nobody had a really in-depth understanding of it. And when I say DNS abuse, we use the ICANN definition, so phishing, farming, malware, botnets, and spam, when used as a delivery mechanism for the other four. This project, we took to an academic partner and said, we want to understand this to the best possible way. We want an academically rigorous methodology that is consistent over time and can be compared. We don't just want domains on a list and no other context. We want you to try to evidence this, and we want to understand it broken down to TLDs and to registrars. We also want to know if the domains are maliciously registered, so registered for the purpose of phishing or malware, or if it's a case of compromise. So typically this happens at the website level, a content management system gets compromised through a vulnerability, and then that's used for malware or phishing. So we partnered with Core Labs, which is a spin-off from Grenoble Alpes University. Some of you might know Maciej Koniński, who runs that, and they came up with a pretty comprehensive and transparent methodology to explain how they're getting to the numbers that they are. They also said, we can only really do this for phishing and malware at the moment. We don't think it's possible to cover the other aspects of DNS abuse to the standard that we want to do this. And so this project only looks at phishing and malware, and that's what I'll be discussing today. So this data comes into PIR's data team, who help us then push that out into a bunch of different products. I say products because we don't charge for anything that we produce, and we never will. It's things that we make freely available for the industry and for anyone who wants to understand this. Some of these are public, but we also give individualized dashboards to registries and registrars as well, so they can understand more granularity about what's happening in their zones. So what does that look like? Basically, whenever anyone tries to measure DNS abuse, they tend to do the same thing, which is you figure out, like, what's your purpose, what's your focus? You get a bunch of input, which tends to be reputation block lists that are typically created for network protection, not for measuring harm at the DNS. You undergo a bunch of cleaning to try to narrow that down based on your purpose, and then do some analysis, present that, and people interpret it. So our project works in the same way. Core Labs picked 4 threat feeds that they felt to be the most reliable in this space. That's APWG, URL house. I knew I shouldn't have listed them off the top of my head. Fish tank and OpenFish. They then try to evidence that harm. They do a really significant cleaning process. So they remove what they call special domains. So domains, and this is a publicly available list, domains where it typically wouldn't be appropriate to mitigate at the DNS level. So subdomain providers, dynamic DNS, file sharing, hosting sites. Those get taken out. They deduplicate URLs down to domain names, take out IP addresses, which are often on these lists, and then they go through a really comprehensive process of analysis. So that includes a process to figure out whether the domain has been maliciously registered or it's a case of website compromise, trying to get screenshots, trying to visit those pages and those URLs, taking basically a fingerprint of loads of different attributes. And that becomes important to then go back and measure whether mitigation is happening. They do that at specific intervals, starting at 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15. I think it's then 30, 1 hour, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then every 12 for 30 days. So that all gets packaged up, and we present that and try to interpret that and help drive industry conversations and make that available. So today I'm going to use that to try to apply it to the question about what abuse looks like in the Baltics. So first, caveats. All of these types of projects, all data is best efforts. We do the best we can to make this as accurate as possible, but no list without false positives really exists. And the starting point, as I said, is imperfect. RBLs are not created for the purpose of DNS level mitigation. They're typically created for network protection. So we do have some challenges when we try to measure. Some areas, particularly when you go down to the individual TLD, can have really low numbers. I'm pretty sure a lot of the lists have a geographical bias. So I would love to know from local experience if you have other views on this and you have other lists that have much more of the local abuse, if you have it. And we struggle a little bit with geo-blocking as well. A lot of abuse can be pretty targeted and only accessible in certain ways. But with all this in mind, also we optimize for accuracy over coverage. So we're not trying to measure this is all the harm that's out there. And usually when we talk to operators, they say, oh, we see a lot more in our abuse desk than what you're showing us. But that tends to be pretty consistent across the board, which helps with comparisons over time and across different TLDs and different registrars. So with all that in mind, let's have a look at some data. So this is CCTLD data from our TLD data set grouped into the ICANN regions. And some of my keys have fallen off the slides, but that's okay. And so what I'm showing you is basically the raw volume of unique domains per month that we've classified as maliciously registered. And we're starting in June 2022 and coming up to May this year. And you can see that different regions have had different peaks and drops. Europe is kind of in this light, I don't have a clicker, this light green color in the middle. And you can see that Asia Pacific is at the top, although they've had some interesting drop-offs. And also Africa is that dark purple line, which has had a little bit of a drop-off as well around March 2023. I don't know if anyone can guess what that might have been. So this is, of course, just looking at raw numbers, so size of TLD is going to be part of it. That drop-off, I think, is largely related to what happened with Freenom. So Freenom were offering free registrations in a selection of different TLDs, and they were also acting as a free registrar service. The biggest one was TK, which is the island of Tokelau. Freenom was also operating a few African CCTLDs in the same way, and I do think it's an industry secret that when you offer everything for free, you tend to end up with a lot of abuse as well. So Freenom closed around that time, and the abuse kind of just dropped off in all the lists that we were monitoring, which I think is what is leading to that drop. You'll see there's another kind of peak in volume here. I don't know if these people can really see. Around the new GTLD contracts, I don't know if that's the reason. That's just the only thing I could think of that might be part of that change in volume. But it's open to, to discussion. I think it's interesting. I'm not sure exactly what is driving that, but that's one theory. So where are the Baltics? You're in that little tiny kind of end bit of all of the small amounts. So let's go a little bit closer and have a look. So this is the same data. So it's stacked by TLD in raw volume across time. But we're looking only at European ccTLDs here. So again, we're not making this a rate of abuse, so you're going to get a larger volume in larger ccTLDs. And again, our Baltics are kind of hidden away in this end long tail. So what does that look like more closely? So this is the same data, but I've taken an average over that time period and then represented it by TLD. So we're still looking at raw volume. It's just an average of how much you would get per month over that time period, which was June 2022 to May 2025. And as you can see, our Baltic TLDs are, again, down in this end tail with an average of 2 domains per month in EE, 2 in LV, and 1 in LT. So those are all really, really small numbers. Our public reporting, we make exclusions because we know that there could be false positives and things like that. So you need to have 5 a month to get into our low abuse tables, and you need to have 10 a month to get into our high abuse tables. So typically the Baltics are in our appendix for low rates of abuse. For low numbers of abuse, which means they don't end up in our rates of abuse. I've kind of ignored our usual minimum requirements and just calculated the rate per 100,000 domains under management anyway to give you a sense of that. And this is just looking at Europe. Again, it's an average. It does mean that some of these TLDs are quite small and the numbers might have been quite small. But again, even if you look at it as a rate compared to the size of domains under management, the Baltics perform well. So 1.1, 1.2, 0.8. So this is just looking at Europe, but let's have a look at what that means compared to our public reporting, where we publish tables on all TLDs. So keep these numbers, these rate numbers in mind as we look at the next slides. And I'll share the presenter pane and move over here. So this is from one of our most recent reports this year, but I think it's fairly typical. So we publish 2 tables for low abuse in ccTLDs, large and small. So this is the large one from July this year. And you can see that the rate of abuse ranges between 0.47 and 1.08, which is not too different to the rates we're seeing in the Baltics. But these ccTLDs, some of them probably have a much bigger base to be working with to calculate that, which tends to be an advantage. In our smaller ccTLDs, the rates range between 0.69 and 4.5. So from slightly lower to a bit higher than what we see in the Baltic numbers. If we look at GTLDs, then what we saw in the smaller ones was a range of 4.6 to 12.03, so all higher in the smaller GTLDs. And this is the same data, but for the larger GTLDs, so ranging from 1.8 to 4.9. So again, higher than what we see in the Baltic numbers. So what about your registrars? This was a more difficult one for me to analyze. As far as I can tell from the largest registrars in each country, from the top 3 in each country, I could only find that 2 of them were also ICANN accredited. Happy to stand corrected on this if I couldn't find them. But this is a challenge because we have a pretty hard time allocating domains that we find on block lists to registrars who only operate locally in ccTLDs. It's quite hard to do that matching because in GTLDs everything is formalized, everything is open, everything is standardized, and so it's much easier for us to figure out, oh, this .com domain belongs to GoDaddy. So that's why we have a hard time with this data, that if there's abuse in local registrars, it should still show up in your TLD data, because it's quite obvious who the CCTLD is, but we don't put it into our registrar data set that we offer. We only use GTLD, and that was to create consistency in how we presented that information, because it's harder in some CCTLDs than it is in others, so it disadvantages or advantages different registrars. So, of those two registrars, one is growing a lot, and one seems to remain quite stable. I'm going to give you an indication of each of those. So register number 2 is the one that has remained relatively stable over this period. So this chart on the left is showing you domains under management across the same time period. And then the chart on the right is showing you a track of their malicious domains per 100,000 domains that they hold. So that's the same rate that we use in our public reporting. And the range here is between 4.6 to 34.1. So is that good or bad? Sometimes it's hard to tell with these things, isn't it? We have a very, very rough rule of thumb when we talk to people that below 5 is pretty good, above 10 you might have a challenge on your hands. So this has obviously changed during the time that we have been collecting data, and it has kind of gone up and down. Perhaps that's just a natural peak and it will drop down again. Registrar number 1, and I probably should have put these in different order, has been growing rapidly over our data period. Previously, they were listed in our public reporting tables as having a pretty high rate of abuse, around 91. They were on the top of our public tables at one point. We actually had a really good conversation with this registrar, and they very much, to their credit, took this on board and said, we don't want to be on the top of these tables, we're going to do something about it. And you can see, as they've continued to grow, their malicious rate has gone down over time, till it's about 8 or so, which I think is pretty impressive. So what does that look like compared to our public reporting? So recently we've been seeing that abuse has become increasingly concentrated with specific registrars in the GTLD space. We have another blog on this on our website, but you'll see this reflected in our public reporting too, that the names at the top of our lists, which are Aceville, Alterhost, Dominet, NIC, their numbers are just like astronomically bigger than what we're seeing anywhere else. So this table is ranging from 88 to 2,304. So actually 91 and 34 don't look too bad to these outliers, and this table at this particular point in time. And I guess the other thing I should mention about this table is we do something called consistency requirements. So when we were creating this, we didn't want to sort of name and shame or penalize registrars or TLDs that just had a bad month, because everybody can have a bad month. And so what we tried to do was create a system where you had to be consistently having high rates of abuse. And so that's why you'll see some names redacted, and you'll see these numbers of months at the side. So if we're going to name you in this table, then you need to be in the table for at least 4 of the last 6 months. So we give you kind of 3 months, and then we'll always tell you if you're in it. But then when you get to 4, 5, or 6, then we start unredacting, which is why some are redacted here. What does low look like for a registrar? So the low is pretty low at the moment. This is smaller registrars on the left and larger registrars on the right. And the rates are 1.2 to 2.9, and then sub 1 to 109. So the low has been becoming increasingly low over time, which kind of puts our previous registrars, I guess, somewhere in the middle of both of these. So what can you do about the flow of malicious registrations? There's been a lot of focus, particularly in the ICANN space, on mitigating reports that are evidencing abuse is already happening. The GTLD contract amendments changed the contracts in 2024 to require registrars to mitigate when it's appropriate. But now I feel like we're talking more and more about what do you do if you have malicious registrations coming in at a rate that is disproportionate. And the conversations I usually have with registrars go something like this, where we say, have you looked at the reports you're mitigating and identified any patterns? Are there things that link these together? Because often these types of campaigns, particularly like the phishing ones, they tend to have quite a lot of domains registered, and they're blasted out to try to capture a lot of people. So some of the similarities we've seen in our data, you can have alphanumeric patterns, so like com-, gov-. There can be similarities around the time, the method of registration. We had one registrar that had quite a lot of abuse coming up, and then they decided that they were going to limit cryptocurrency payments to customers who had already demonstrated trust. And that led to a big drop-off in their abuse. Another thing to consider is, are the credit cards going through for this in the payments? Are you getting chargebacks? And if so, are there tools from your payment provider that you can utilize to try to detect fraud at the point of registration? Often payment providers have premium tools, you might have to pay for them, but they tend to have a lot more data to try to help you figure out at that point what's a high-risk registration and what isn't. Because that's a difficult thing to do. You don't want to be picking up the vast majority of legitimate registrants, but you want to be trying to accurately pull out the ones that are going to cause you a headache down the line. If anyone's thinking of doing that, and they're not currently doing it, I'd love to chat to you because we want to look more in this space. So, finally, some conclusions. Based on the data I have, I would agree that Baltic CCTLDs do tend to have very low rates of abuse. Is there a geographical bias? Maybe. In terms of the registrars, data's pretty limited, but for the ones I can look at, you're kind of in the middle of what we have in our public reportings, but some really interesting case studies there, I think. Finally, as I was saying about kind of anti-fraud detection, I think this is going to be the next frontier for the industry to look at. It's not just going to be about responding to reports when they make their way to you. It's going to be about also proactively trying to filter out at the point of registration which ones are the highest risk. So we have a lot of free products to help you do that. One final plug, we have a separate project called Netbeakon Reporter. We push the domains from Netbeakon Map through Reporter. Reporter is like a conduit. We automatically send the reports to GTLD registrars. We enrich them and give additional information. We are now also at the point of incorporating CCTLDs. So if you're not already on board, please get on board. LV came on board last night. You can use an API if you want, but you can also just do it with an abuse reporting email. That's going to be simplest, quickest, and the volume's going to be low. So that's all. Thank you. Happy to take any questions. Aita, still working on my Estonian.
Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions directly from the audience. No apps this time. If you have any questions, then I would like to see a show of hands.
I never know if it's a good sign or a bad sign when there's no questions.
Well, I mean, you had a very comprehensive presentation. Yeah. That's all I can say. Well, thank you in that case. But I think you will stick around for...
Yeah, I'm going to stick around. I have a webinar to do a bit later, so I might duck out, but I'll try to stay as long as I can.
Yeah, so you can find Rowena and have a chat if needed. All right, thanks.
Cool. Thank you.
I will skip this.